The day my father signed the papers to disown me, he didn't use words of anger. He used a gold fountain pen and the cold silence of a business transaction. He told me that by marrying a nobody like Joren, I was officially dead to the Vance legacy. My sister Alara stood in the corner with a smirk, already mentally reallocating my share of the empire to her own accounts. They thought that without their leverage, I would wither away in a life of grit and struggle. What they didn't realize was that while they were busy protecting a name, Joren and I were busy building a future they couldn't even imagine. But before I show you how my own family tried to steal the very life they claimed was worth nothing, I have to tell you about the moment the Vance empire began to crumble and why I was the only one who didn't reach out to catch it. The performance of brunch, following my disownment, was a masterclass in Vance family cruelty. Even with my name officially struck from the ledger, my father insisted I attend one final meal, a public audit of my failure. Between courses of chilled lobster and perfectly arranged flowers, the conversation was a sharp, clinical blade. My father reviewed potential infrastructure deals while pointedly mentioning that Joren's greasy hands would never grasp the intricacies of a board meeting. Wesley laughed, a short, ugly sound, remarking that he'd seen Joren's workshop and couldn't distinguish it from a junkyard. They spoke about me as if I were a failing asset being liquidated, yet I sat there with a calm that unnerved them. I realized then that the suffocating air of the Vance estate was no longer something I had to breathe. I left their glass towers and drove to the older part of the city where the garage sanctuary awaited. In Joren's workshop, the air was thick with sawdust and the honest hum of creation, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of my father's study. While my family spent their days managing perceptions and chasing headlines, Joren and I spent our nights over a kitchen table, mapping out a secret blueprint. Joren provided the technical grit, and I provided the branding vision. We developed a logistics software designed for the very makers and independent businesses my father looked down upon. It was $1 billion gap in the market that the Vances were too arrogant to see. Every time my father sent another warning or cut another connection, we simply worked harder. We weren't just building a company, we were building the proof that their leverage was an illusion, and our honesty was the only thing with real worth. The weekly ritual of the Vance family brunch was never about food. It was a cold, clinical performance of power. We sat around a table draped in heirloom linen, the polished silver reflecting the sunlight like surgical instruments. My father occupied the head of the table, his eyes never leaving his phone as he reviewed acquisition targets between bites of poached eggs. My mother orchestrated the atmosphere with the precision of a conductor, ensuring the flowers were exactly 3 inches tall and the conversation remained strictly on guest lists and charity boards. I saw the preliminary figures for the North Corridor project, Wesley remarked, his voice dripping with his usual brand of bored arrogance. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. It's a shame the branding feels uninspired. Perhaps we should have hired someone who understands that a name is a legacy, not a hobby. My father didn't look up, but his silence was an endorsement of the jab. He had spent the morning pointedly ignoring the fact that I had been restructured out of that very project only days before. In this room, every sentence was a weapon used to remind you of your place in the hierarchy. They spoke about Joren with a particular kind of casual cruelty, mocking his greasy hands and the sawdust-filled warehouse he called a workshop. To them, a man who worked with his hands was a man without a soul, a nobody whose existence was a stain on the Vance pedigree. I sat there, practiced and composed, a Bradford with a resume for a face. I had spent 29 years learning how to smile at the right moments while feeling a hollow ache in my chest. But as Wesley continued to drone on about standards and pedigree, the opulence of the room began to feel like a cage. I looked at the perfectly arranged flowers and realized they were just like us, cut at the roots and displayed for an audience until they withered. My family confused leverage with love, and as I reached for my water, I knew that the next time I sat at a table, the air would be thick with sawdust, and the conversation would finally be honest. The garage sanctuary was a world built on grit, grease, and the kind of honesty that didn't exist in my father's glass-walled skyscrapers. I left the suffocating silence of the Vance estate behind, driving until the polished streets turned into cracked pavement and the scent of expensive perfume was replaced by the smell of hot metal and sawdust. Joren was waiting for me, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of the workshop's hanging lights. In this space, I wasn't an asset to be managed or a legacy to be protected. I was just Karys. There were no social hierarchies here, only the steady rhythm of a man who knew the value of restoration. I watched Joren work on a vintage engine, his hands sure and disciplined. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen without being judged. I spent hours sitting on a stack of reclaimed timber, watching him breathe life back into things the world had deemed broken. It was here, surrounded by the raw energy of the workshop, that the first outlines of our secret blueprint began to take shape. My father believed that power was something you inherited or bought, but Joren showed me that real power was something you built with your own hands. The contrast was sharp. My family's world was a performance where every word had a price, but this garage was a sanctuary where silence was enough. As we worked together into the early hours of the morning, mapping out a future that belonged only to us, I realized that the nothing my father warned me about was actually the only thing that felt like everything. The secret blueprint began not in a high-tech lab, but on a scarred wooden workbench, illuminated by a single flickering bulb and the blue light of our shared laptop. While my father's firm was busy trying to monopolize the old world of luxury hospitality, Joren and I were looking at the cracks they had ignored. We spent nights mapping out a logistics interface that prioritized the handcrafted and honest over the mass-produced. Joren understood the physical mechanics of supply, how a delicate antique dresser moves across a city without breaking, while I understood how to tell the story of that movement. Our blueprint was a digital bridge for the independent makers who lived in the older part of the city, the ones who didn't care who my parents were but cared deeply about the integrity of their craft. We stayed up until the sun began to bleed through the garage windows, fueling ourselves with cheap coffee and the intoxicating realization that we were building something that solved a problem the Vances were too arrogant to even see. Joren never once asked about my trust fund or the leverage I had lost. He only asked if the code was elegant and if the branding felt real. As the software took shape, I started noticing that Joren was more than just a mechanic with a vision. He would take midnight calls, speaking in the low, steady tones of a seasoned executive, discussing forecasts and acquisitions with a fluency that made my heart skip. I began to suspect that the nobody I had married was carrying a truth far larger than our small garage, but in that moment it didn't matter. We were two people building a future with our own hands, fueled by the hard edge of freedom that comes when you finally stop living for an audience. The blueprint was our secret, a digital weapon designed to prove that real worth is something you build, not something you inherit. The wedding was not the celebration of a union, but the public execution of my status. My father had chosen the most opulent glass-walled venue in the city, not out of love, but to ensure that the audience for my downfall was as large and influential as possible. As I stood at the altar in a gown that felt more like a shroud, I could feel the collective gaze of the city's elite, the investors, the socialites, and the rivals my father had spent decades trying to impress. They weren't there to witness a marriage. They were there to witness a warning. During the reception, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of judgment. My father stood for the toast, the crystal flute in his hand catching the light like a weapon. He didn't speak of my childhood or my future. Instead, he used the moment to announce, with a voice as steady as a death sentence, that I was being stripped of my inheritance. He framed it as a lesson in accountability, a public disavowal that left the room in a suffocating silence. He wanted everyone to know that a Vance who chose a nobody was no longer a Vance at all. I looked toward the back of the room, where Alara and Tamsin sat together. They weren't shocked. They were vibrating with a quiet, parasitic energy. Tamsin, who had been my shadow since primary school, wouldn't meet my eyes. She was too busy whispering into Alara's ear, her hands fluttering with the nervous excitement of someone who had just realized the seat next to the throne was finally vacant. They watched the wedding example unfold not with pity, but with the cold calculation of scavengers. They saw my father's public rejection as their own personal promotion. Beside me, Joren's hand was a warm, grounding weight against my own. While my family watched like they were attending the burial of my future, he leaned in and whispered, "Let them have the theater, Karys. We're building the reality." I walked out of that glass venue with a wedding ring and a target on my back, but for the first time, the Bradford mask had slipped entirely. My father thought he had made me an example of what happens when you lose your leverage. He didn't realize he had actually given me the one thing he feared most, a reason to never look back. I left the silk and the champagne behind, heading toward the garage where the only things that mattered were the blueprints on the table and the man who didn't need a last name to know my worth. The months that followed were a blur of caffeine, code, and the kind of exhaustion that felt like a badge of honor. We lived in a cramped apartment above a bakery, the scent of yeast and sugar a constant companion to the late-night hum of our servers. Our startup, Vanguard Logistics, was no longer just a secret blueprint. It was a living, breathing entity. While my father's empire was built on the slow, heavy movement of old money, ours was built on the rapid, precise pulse of real-time solutions. The success they couldn't buy arrived not with a celebratory gala, but with a simple notification on our shared laptop. We had landed the contract for the Sterling Group, a massive, independent collective of artisans and high-end manufacturers that my father's firm had been chasing for years. They didn't care about the Vance name. They cared that our software was more efficient, more transparent, and more reliable than the bloated, outdated systems my family used to maintain their monopolies. As the news of our partnership hit the industry trade journals, the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. I started seeing my own face in the Business Insider sections that used to only feature my father's grim profile. We weren't just a niche startup anymore, we were a disruptor. Investors who had once crossed the street to avoid me during my social exile were suddenly flooding my inbox with meeting requests. I remember standing in the garage, now converted into a sleek, functional headquarters, watching Joren walk through the lines of new hires. He still wore his work boots, and he still had that calm, centered energy, but the world was finally beginning to see him through my eyes. We were outperforming the Vance family firm in every metric that mattered: speed, innovation, and client retention. For the first time, the Bradford legacy felt like a relic of a bygone era. I had proven that my value wasn't a performance. It was something I had built from the ground up, out of grit and the refusal to be managed. We were winning, and as I watched our revenue charts climb, I felt a sense of peace. I thought the hardest part was over. I didn't realize that in the world of the Vances, success didn't earn you respect. It only made you a target for a more intimate kind of theft. The people who had watched me fall were now watching me fly, and they were already sharpening their shears. The betrayal didn't arrive with a confrontation. It arrived with a silence that felt too heavy to be natural. 4 weeks, Tamsin had been a constant fixture in our new office, playing the role of the supportive best friend while I pored over the final proprietary source code for our expansion. I trusted her with the keys to our digital kingdom because I still viewed her through the lens of childhood sleepovers and shared secrets, rather than the predator she had become. I didn't notice the way her eyes lingered on my screen or how often she stayed late, helping with the filing. Then, on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, the world tilted. I walked into the office to find Tamsin's desk cleared and her company credentials deactivated. My heart sank, thinking something terrible had happened, until Joren called me over to his monitor. There, on the front page of the industry's leading tech journal, was a headline that felt like a physical blow: Vance Global launches Unity Link, the future of boutique logistics. I didn't even have to read the article to know what it said. The screenshots were identical to our interface. The logic was our logic. The secret blueprint we had spent months perfecting in a sawdust-filled garage had been gift-wrapped and handed to my sister. Elara appeared in the press photo, looking every bit the corporate savior, with Tamsin standing just behind her shoulder as the newly appointed chief operating officer. The realization was a cold, hollow ache in my chest. Tamsin hadn't just left. She had harvested every client list, every line of code, and every strategy one had shared over coffee. She had used my misplaced loyalty as a master key to bypass our security. They hadn't just stolen a business idea. They had stolen the proof of my independence. By mid-afternoon, the Vance launch was the only thing anyone in the industry was talking about. My father's firm was using their massive marketing budget and decades of leverage to drown out our existence, framing our original work as a primitive precursor to their superior version. As I watched the news cycle celebrate my sister for a brilliance she didn't possess, I realized that my flaw hadn't been a lack of business acumen. It had been the belief that blood and history were thicker than greed. I was standing in a quiet office, surrounded by the ghosts of a vision that was currently being sold under my family's name, realizing that the people I loved had finally decided that my life was worth more to them as a trophy than as a person. The corporate sabotage that followed was not a swift blow, but a slow, agonizing strangulation of everything Joren and I had built. My father didn't just want to steal our idea, he wanted to erase the very possibility of our success. Within 48 hours of the Vance global launch, the industry atmosphere shifted from curiosity to a chilling frost. Our phones, which had been ringing incessantly with new inquiries, suddenly went silent. I sat at my desk, watching in real time as our biggest clients, people I had shared coffee with, people who had praised our innovation, sent standardized emails reevaluating their partnerships. My father was using the Vance name like a blunt instrument, offering exclusive rebates and prestige tiers to anyone who transitioned to their stolen platform. It wasn't about the quality of the software, it was about the leverage of a legacy. He was reminding the market that in this city, you didn't bet against a Vance, especially not for a daughter who had been publicly stripped of her value. The most painful part was seeing my own words and branding used against me. Ilara appeared on every major business network, draped in the same cold composure our father favored, reciting the marketing hooks I had written at my kitchen table. She spoke about restoring integrity to logistics, while standing on the bones of a company she had helped dismantle. Even more galling was the smear campaign that began to circulate in the shadows of the trade journals. Anonymous sources I knew were Tamsin, leaked concerns about our startup's financial stability and unproven leadership. Joren stayed steady, his presence a calm anchor in the rising tide of our collapse. He didn't rail against the unfairness of it. He simply went back to the code, his fingers flying across the keys with a renewed, quiet intensity. But as the corporate sabotage intensified, as our bank accounts dwindled and our office grew hollow and empty, the emotional weight began to feel unbearable. I realized that my family wasn't just trying to win a business war, they were trying to prove that without them, I was nothing. I stood by the window of our garage-turned office, looking out at the city skyline where the Vance logo glowed like a predatory eye. They had poached our clients, stolen our soul, and dragged my reputation through the dirt of their own making. But as I watched Joren work, a new kind of resilience began to take root in the wreckage. My family believed that because they had the name, they had the power. They didn't realize that by stealing the blueprint without understanding the heart behind it, they had just built a magnificent ship with a hollow hull, and the storm was already beginning to gather. The great collapse began not with a bang, but with a series of flickering red lights on a server rack that Ilara didn't know how to read. My family had stolen the Vance launch like a trophy, but they had forgotten that a ship without an engine is just a hollow ornament. Because Ilara and Tamsin had prioritized leverage over logic, they had stripped the code of its most essential, complex safeguards to speed up the launch. They wanted the glory of the announcement, but they lacked the technical heart to sustain the reality. By the second week, the proprietary system they had poached from us began to buckle under the weight of the very prestige clients they had stolen. My father's greed had led them to overpromise capacity, and without Joren's deep understanding of the back-end architecture, the software began to hallucinate data. Shipments were routed to the wrong continents, inventory levels glitched into the millions, and the real-time tracking, the crown jewel of our design, went dark for hours at a time. I watched from our quiet garage as the industry news cycle pivoted from celebration to panic. The Sterling Group, the first major client to desert us for the Vance name, was now the first to experience the fallout. Their high-end artisan goods were being lost in a digital void, and because my sister had restructured the support team to cut costs, there was no one to answer their calls. Ilara had confused control with competence, believing that because she owned the name on the building, she owned the skill within it. The biggest moment of tension arrived when the Vance global servers suffered a total systemic failure. Tamsin had tried to patch the stolen code with a crude bypass, but it only served to trigger the internal integrity checks Joren had written into the foundation of the program. The Vance launch didn't just stall, it imploded. Millions of dollars in logistics contracts were frozen, and the Vance brand, once a symbol of unshakable power, became a liability. The collapse was a mirror of my family's own nature, expensive, polished, and fundamentally broken at the core. They had built a magnificent theater and invited the whole world to watch, only for the stage to give way beneath them. As I sat in our small office, the silence was finally broken by a phone call. It wasn't a client. It was my mother's personal assistant, her voice trembling as she asked if I was available for an emergency family summit. The pride of the Vances had finally run into the reality of their own incompetence, and for the first time in my life, the leverage was entirely in my hands. The rebirth of value arrived not with a victory march, but with the sound of my father's voice breaking through the speaker of my phone. He didn't open with an apology, he opened with a demand disguised as a plea. The Vance global systems were in total gridlock, their reputation was bleeding out in the press, and the board of directors was circling like sharks. He needed me to come home and fix the mess Alara had created. He spoke as if he were offering me a promotion rather than asking for a lifeline, still convinced that his approval was the ultimate currency. When I walked into the Vance estate for the emergency summit, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The clinical chill had been replaced by a frantic, desperate energy. My father sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by printed system error reports, looking older and smaller than I had ever seen him. Alara was pacing by the window, her face pale and drawn, while Tamsin sat in the corner, already looking like a stranger. They had realized too late that you can steal a map, but you cannot steal the intuition required to navigate the terrain. "Fix it, Karys," my father said, pushing a folder toward me. "Tell your husband to unlock the back-end protocols. We'll reinstate your inheritance. We'll even give you a seat on the board. Just make this go away." I looked at the folder, then at the sister who had betrayed me and the father who had traded my dignity for a headline. For years, I had craved this moment, the moment they would finally admit they needed me. But as I stood there, I felt only a profound sense of detachment. The leverage they were offering, the money, the seat, the name, felt like toys from a childhood I had outgrown. They were still trying to buy my talent, still trying to treat me as a tool to be utilized rather than a person to be respected. "I'm not a Vance anymore, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You made sure of that with a gold fountain pen. And Joren isn't a nobody, he's the man who built the heart of the system you tried to steal. You didn't just take our code, you took our trust. And that's the one thing you can't buy back." I turned to leave, ignoring Alara's sharp cry of protest and my father's stunned silence. I walked out of the estate and back to the garage, where Joren was waiting. We didn't need their empire to be whole. We had our own clients, our own integrity, and a future that didn't come with conditions. I had lost an inheritance, but I had found a life that finally belonged to me. The Vances could keep their hollow throne. I had found the rebirth of my own value in the honesty of the work I had done with my own hands. The legal counterstrike was not a loud confrontation in a courtroom, but a quiet, digital checkmate delivered from our garage. As the Vance global systems continued to hemorrhage data, my father's legal team sent a flurry of cease and desist orders, ironically claiming that we were infringing on their newly launched intellectual property. They were trying to use the law as a final act of bullying, hoping to bury us under legal fees before the truth of their theft could reach the light of any public hearing. I sat with Joren as he pulled up the foundation of the original source code we had written together. He hadn't just built a logistics platform, he had built a legacy with a memory. "They stole the architecture," Joren said, his voice calm as he highlighted a series of hidden lines. "But they didn't realize the bricks were signed. Embedded deep within the core logic were digital watermarks, mathematical signatures that were inseparable from the code's functionality. If anyone tried to strip them out, the system would perceive it as a corruption and begin to shudder. More importantly, we had embedded a kill switch protocol that triggered specifically when the code was hosted on unauthorized servers without the secondary encryption keys that only Joren and I possessed. We didn't need to sue them to stop them, we just had to let the code do what it was designed to do, protect its creator. While Alara was on a conference call with frantic shareholders, Joren executed a single command. Across the city, the Vance Global interface began to display our original startup logo, the one they had tried to erase, on every client dashboard. It was a digital confession. The message was clear. The Vances weren't innovators, they were scavengers. By the time my father realized what was happening, the kill switch had locked the Vance servers into a read-only state, effectively freezing their entire operation. We didn't send a process server to their door, we sent a mirror. They were left holding a broken, stolen machine that loudly broadcasted its true origin to the entire industry. For the first time, my father's leverage couldn't stop the truth from uploading. We weren't just fighting for a business anymore. We were proving that you cannot own the soul of a thing you didn't have the heart to create. The industry response was swift and merciless, turning the Vance name into a cautionary tale overnight. The social pariahs weren't created by a courtroom drama, but by the undeniable evidence of their own incompetence glowing on every client's screen. By the time the kill switch had fully locked down their servers, the reputation my father had spent 40 years building was effectively dismantled. The elite circles they moved in, the same people who had watched my public disinheritance with a sense of morbid curiosity, now looked at the Vances with a far more dangerous emotion, contempt. No one in our world cares much about a family feud, but everyone cares about a liability. Investors began pulling out of Vance global projects before the markets even opened the next morning. The Sterling Group issued a blistering public statement, formally cutting ties and announcing they were returning to our original platform, citing the integrity of the founder over the hollow promises of a legacy firm. My father had spent his life teaching me that a last name was an indestructible shield, but I watched as that shield shattered under the weight of a single honest truth. The Vance estate, once a hub of social power, became a fortress of silence. Neighbors who had once vied for brunch invitations now looked away when my father's car pulled into the drive. The local country club suspended my brother's membership following concerns over the family's business ethics. They were being erased from the very world they had used to exile me. It was a cold, quiet isolation that no amount of money could fix. I stayed in the garage with Joren, far from the wreckage. We didn't celebrate their downfall. We were too busy handling the flood of returning clients. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been redefined. The nobody and the disinherited daughter were now the only stable ground in a collapsing market. My family had thought they were the ones who decided who belonged and who didn't, but as the industry turned its back on them, they realized that respect isn't something you can inherit. It's something you can lose in a single, dishonest afternoon. The Vances had become the very thing they feared most. Irrelevant. Tamsin's regret didn't manifest as a heartfelt apology, but as the frantic, jagged desperation of someone who had realized they were the first person to be sacrificed when the ship began to sink. Once the Vance launch turned into a global disaster, the Vance family's protective shield didn't extend to her. She wasn't blood. She was just an instrument they had used to orchestrate a theft, and now that the instrument was broken, they discarded her with a clinical efficiency that even I found chilling. I was sitting in our office when she arrived, unannounced and looking like a ghost of the woman who had smirked at my wedding. Gone was the expensive designer blazer she'd worn during the press release. In its place was the hollowed-out expression of someone who had finally seen the true face of the people she'd betrayed me for. She tried to cry, her voice trembling as she spoke about pressure and being misled by Alara, but the tears felt as artificial as the code she had stolen. "Karys, you have to help me," she whispered, her hands shaking on our scarred wooden desk. "They're blaming me for everything. The board is looking for a scapegoat for the data breach, and Alara has already signed a statement saying I acted alone. They're going to destroy my career. They're going to file criminal charges." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to fix her problems. I remember the nights we spent in this very room, the way I had shared my dreams with her over cold coffee, and how she had been mentally pricing them for my sister the whole time. She hadn't been a victim of the Vances. She had been their willing apprentice until she became their liability. "You chose them because you thought they were the winners, Tamsin," I said, my voice devoid of the anger she was expecting. "You thought their leverage was more valuable than our loyalty. But the thing about the Vances is that they don't have friends. They have assets. And you've just been depreciated." I didn't offer her a way out. I didn't call Joren to see if he could undo the digital watermark that had implicated her. I simply stood up and opened the door. As she walked out into the cold afternoon air, I realized that her regret wasn't about the friendship we'd lost. It was about the fact that she bet on the wrong empire. She was a stranger now, a casualty of a war she had started, leaving me with the quiet realization that some betrayals are so absolute They leave nothing behind to even forgive. The empty estate was a mausoleum of gold and velvet, a monument to a legacy that had finally run out of time. When I pulled up the long, winding driveway, the manicured lawns looked the same, and the limestone pillars stood as tall as ever, but the air around the Vance manor felt thin, as if the very spirit of the place had been sucked out by the vacuum of their scandal. There were no black cars lining the drive, no caterers rushing through the side doors, and no sound of laughter echoing from the terrace. I found my parents in the solarium, the room where they had once hosted the city's elite to discuss market dominance over chilled mimosas. My father was sitting in a high-backed chair, staring out at the fountain that had been turned off to save on maintenance costs. He didn't look like the titan who had signed the paper execution with a gold fountain pen. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his mahogany desk was just wood. My mother sat across from him, her posture still perfect, though she was staring at a stack of legal notices as if they were a language she had forgotten how to read. "The creditors are calling, Karys," she said, her voice brittle and devoid of its usual melodic control. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention Joren. She just looked at me as if I were a line of credit that might still be open. "They're talking about the art, the summer house, everything we've built, everything you bought," I corrected gently. I stood in the center of the room, realizing that for the first time, I didn't feel the need to shrink. The clinical chill of the house no longer had power over me because I was no longer an asset they could manage. I looked around at the portraits of ancestors who had valued names over souls, and they felt like strangers. My father finally turned his head, his eyes landing on me with a flicker of the old fire, but it was quickly extinguished by the weight of his reality. "You could have saved us," he whispered. "With your husband's access, we could have folded your startup into the Vance name. We could have survived. You could have loved me," I replied, the words landing with a quiet finality that silenced the room. "But you chose leverage instead. You thought the estate was the empire, but the empire was always the people you were willing to sacrifice to keep it." I walked through the hollow halls one last time, past the empty ballroom and the silent library. The Vances had spent 40 years building a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize they had accidentally locked themselves in with nothing but their own greed. I stepped out into the sunlight and didn't look back. I was leaving a graveyard of dreams, heading home to a workshop filled with sawdust, and a life that was finally, unyieldingly mine. The revelation of Joren's true standing didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in the quiet of our kitchen, over 2 lukewarm cups of coffee. As the Vance estate crumbled under the weight of its own debt and the scandal of the stolen code, Joren slid a folder across the scarred wooden table toward me. It wasn't filled with legal threats or marketing strategies. It was a portfolio of land deeds, infrastructure bonds, and independent holdings that had been quietly accumulating for over a decade. "I never wanted you to think I was the solution to your family's problems," Joren said, his voice as steady as the day he first held my hand in the workshop. "I wanted you to see that we were the solution to our own." I stared at the documents, the realization hitting me with the force of a tidal wave. While my father had been playing a high-stakes game of leverage with borrowed money and social favors, Joren had been building a fortress of tangible value. He wasn't just a mechanic with a vision. He was the silent architect of the very infrastructure the Vances had tried to monopolize. The workshop wasn't a hiding place. It was the heart of an operation far more stable than the debt-ridden empire my father called a legacy. Joren showed me that our modest success was never actually fragile. Our startup was backed by a foundation of real assets that my family couldn't fathom because they were too busy looking for a famous last name to notice a solid foundation. He had stayed in the garage because he valued the restoration of things, including my own sense of self-worth. He wanted me to build my business with my own hands so that when the truth came out, I would know that I didn't need his money any more than I needed my father's. Standing there, I looked at the man the Vances had dismissed as a nobody. He was a titan who didn't feel the need to roar. His wealth didn't come with the clinical chill of the estate. It came with the warmth of loyalty and the resilience of hard work. I realized then that my father's power was a fragile illusion made of glass and ego, while Joren's was made of iron and integrity. We weren't just fine. We were untouchable. For the first time, I wasn't just a woman who had escaped a predatory family. I was a woman standing on ground so solid that no amount of Vance leverage could ever make it shake again. The final board meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room that had once been the seat of my father's absolute authority. Now, it felt like a cold, transparent cage. The air conditioning hummed with clinical indifference as I sat across from the man who had once signed my life away with a gold fountain pen. He looked smaller, his expensive wool suit hanging off a frame that had been hollowed out by the collapse. Beside him, a line of grim-faced lawyers shuffled papers, their movements devoid of the predatory confidence they usually carried. "It's a straightforward buyout, Karys," one of the attorneys murmured, not meeting my eyes. "The debt-to-equity ratio has reached a terminal point. Vance Global is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost." My father finally looked up. There was no fire left in his gaze, only a dull, aching confusion. He pushed a single sheet of paper toward me, a formal request for my company to acquire his failing firm. The leverage he had once used to keep me in line had vanished, replaced by a desperate need for a bailout. He was asking me to buy the wreckage of his legacy for pennies on the dollar. "You'd keep the name, of course," my father whispered, his voice cracking. "The Vance name still has weight." I looked at the signature line and then back at him. I remembered the performance brunch, the paper execution, and the way Alara had smirked while they stripped me of my worth. I thought of Joren's workshop, the scent of sawdust, and the secret blueprint we had built from nothing but honesty and grit. "No," I said, sliding the paper back across the mahogany. "I'll buy the assets. I'll take the infrastructure and the contracts. But the name stays with you." The silence that followed was the heaviest I had ever felt in that room. He realized then that I wasn't just refusing his inheritance, I was refusing his identity. I didn't need the Vance name to be whole, and I certainly didn't need it to be successful. I was buying the tools, but I was leaving the ego behind. As I stood up to leave, I realized the meeting wasn't a victory. It was a funeral for a world built on leverage, and I was the only one walking out of the room alive.